I was converted from atheism about 45 years ago. But before my conversion to Christianity, although I didn't read the Bible, I really loved other ancient subjects. Especially I loved Greek subjects, Greek mythology, Greek history. So I really enjoyed back in 2019 when a couple times I was able to visit Greece for various occasions that were part of my work at that time. And while we were there, I really enjoyed visiting the sites in Athens the second time with my wife. So I'm learning how to do screen share, and hopefully you can see the screen there with my wife and myself. And I'm hoping I can make this this work ideally. So Paul was in Athens, obviously, a long time before we were, and well, some of the structures looked a bit more intact back then than they look now, but Athens has done a pretty good job with keeping these things up, considering all the years and all the ravages of time and circumstance that they've been through. But when Paul got there in 1718, we find out that he was talking with some philosophers, Stoics and Epicureans. And that really shouldn't surprise us because, well, Athens was known as the center of philosophy. There were a lot of other places, Miletus and Tarsus, where Paul was from, and Ephesus and elsewhere, Alexandria in northern Egypt, although the Greeks there said Alexandria near Egypt. But these were all places where philosophy was strong. Some of them, probably by this point, had actually overshadowed Athens. But Athens had the reputation and the history behind it that when people thought of Athens, they thought of philosophy. And when Athenians thought of Athens, they often thought of philosophy and intellectual prowess. In Roman times, philosophy dealt more with ethics than some traditional philosophic kinds of issues. That is, they were more interested in how to behave than in cosmology and so on. Religions, by contrast, didn't deal with ethics nearly as much as philosophy did. So early Christianity, actually, some people thought of it as kind of a philosophic school because it taught ethics, it taught right behavior, probably more than it really emphasized cosmology. Philosophers were often thought to be unreligious by other people. Many philosophers discarded the gods, the traditional gods, as superstitious, but they allowed for it for the masses. They thought, well, later on, of course, you have people saying religion is the opiate of the masses. There were a lot of Greek thinkers who saw popular traditional religion as okay for the masses, but they had their own views about deity or the divine that differed from the masses. Most of them weren't atheists. The Epicureans probably came closest to that, but they often attacked religion as superstitious. Plato, however, said that religion was necessary for the proper functioning of the state, but he would have liked to have eradicated private worship. He wanted religion that could be used to promote good morals within society. Romans didn't always trust philosophers, although that was especially in an earlier period. And earlier there had been kind of a rhetorical war between rhetoric and philosophy. Orators said, what's the purpose of trying to promote your ideas if you can't communicate them well? And philosophers said, what's the point of communicating well if what you're communicating isn't correct? And so there was a big debate between them. By this period, most of that debate had blown over in that most speakers respected philosophy, or at least gave lip service to it, sometimes quoting philosophers, though they would sometimes make fun of philosophers not really communicating well. And philosophers still sometimes would put down those who just had empty rhetoric, but many of them said it's all right to use rhetoric as long as what you're communicating has substance. Athens was famous from an ancient period. It was still the subject of lectures on great cities, but its glory had faded to a great degree. It had a reputation for great philosophers, but now was behind Alexandria and Tarsus, which were also university centers. The following photos, most of these are taken from Athens or from nearby sites when I was there. This is a model from a museum in Athens of the Acropolis, the century after Paul was there. It was a free city, so it wasn't technically run as part of the province of Achaia. That may be one reason that Paul can speak, if he's not just speaking generally. In 1 Corinthians 16:15, the first converts from Achaia, or the first fruits of Achaia, the province of Achaia, which was basically Greece, especially the southern part of Greece. The northern part was Macedonia. But the southern part, not including Athens as part of that, even though Acts tells us that he had some converts there. Well, later on, rabbis had stories of debating with philosophers, probably not true stories given the genre of these debates, but at the same time, their literary function was to show that rabbinic wisdom was greater than the wisdom of these philosophers. Now, speeches are very important in Acts. They make up maybe a quarter of Acts. Some say more, some say less, depending on what you actually count, the speech or the whole context of the speech. But some of the speeches have an apologetic function. That is, they defend the faith. Paul is defending his faith against the accusations of other Jewish thinkers. He's defending the faith against charges that were brought against him in Roman courts. But here, he's going to articulate the faith in ways that the philosophically minded can understand and maybe appreciate. Apologetics and philosophy, many Jewish thinkers for centuries before the time of Paul had already pioneered much of this way of approaching Greek philosophy. They'd plundered the most useful contributions of Greek philosophy for centuries and claimed that actually, no, the philosophers had plagiarized Moses. And actually, some of the philosophers' ideas probably did come from Middle Eastern sources and from Egypt and Syria and elsewhere. So it's possible. But they claimed that philosophers had plagiarized Moses, and later Christian philosophers, Christian apologists like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century followed that idea. Some Greeks also thought that Pythagoras drew from Judaism. And Hellenistic Jews depicted Abraham as a philosopher. You have that in Philo and 4th Maccabees and Aristeas. Well, when Paul gets to Athens, he doesn't start by saying philosophers. It says in Acts 17:16 that he was stirred when he saw the idols of Athens. Here was this brilliant culture, and it was full of idols, full of statues. And here are just some pictures of statues from in and around Athens. The one of me with an Asbury Seminary shirt on, I'm not a statue, but the other things in the picture are mostly statuary and different deities or symbols. Contest between Athena and Poseidon. Now, Athena became the patron deity of Athens, but Poseidon was in the running for it. Athena won, but Poseidon was very popular as well. The Parthenon was the massive temple of Athena there. You can't quite tell how massive in this picture, and you can't see exactly what it looked like back then, but hopefully you can see they took the worship of Athena quite seriously. And also you have a lot of things that Greeks themselves would recognize as unpleasant. Here's a 4th century BC winged demon abducting a girl, statue of that. So some things could be a little bit scary, although scary things weren't limited to Athens by any means. By the way, the Sphinx in that picture, you may think of sphinxes as associated with Egypt, and that's true, but Greeks also had adopted sphinxes. Well, Paul was dialoguing with people in the Roman Agora, and we have some pictures of it here. Again, it was in better shape back in Paul's day. And Paul is talking with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers there. Both were pretty popular philosophic schools at this time. Platonism was probably more popular in Egypt at this point, in Alexandria, but in Athens and in the northern Mediterranean, Stoicism was probably the dominant philosophic school. And of course, most people on the street, they just picked up bits and pieces here and there of different philosophies. But those who had any education knew a little bit about, here's what Stoics think, here's what Epicureans think. In any case, some of them think that Paul may be introducing strange gods or foreign gods. Now that could get him in some serious trouble. As far as the danger of initiating the worship of foreign gods, Josephus, writing in the 1st century, tells us that a number of centuries before, about half a millennium earlier, a priestess in Athens was stoned to death for this. But especially it's an allusion to Socrates. In the next verse, Paul will be led to the Areopagus. Well, the Areopagus was the high court of Athens that had tried Socrates on this charge of introducing foreign gods. They tried him on that charge, again, not a full half millennium earlier, but close to that, over 400 years earlier. And Socrates was ultimately executed. Now, there's no idea here that Paul is going to be executed. Athenians looked back with great respect for Socrates by this point. Everybody in cities in the Roman Empire, everybody who had even the least bit of education in Greek and Greek culture, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially again in the cities, Socrates was highly respected, and pretty much everybody knew it was a mistake that he'd been executed. But you kind of have a joke here that may be making fun of the philosopher's intelligence. They know their philosophic school really well, but they have no understanding of what Paul is talking about. He probably didn't fully understand their philosophies either, but he knows the true God. He's proclaiming the true God. And sometimes when we proclaim the true God, we are talking with people who don't have the same worldview we do. I mean, when I was an atheist, there were things that I didn't know about Christianity and that would have blown my mind. And I was approaching it from a very wrong worldview. Well, lots of people have other worldviews that can't quite digest the Christian message. And so, Paul is dialoguing with them. That's what you do. People don't fully understand. You dialogue. You try to help them understand. As long as they're willing to talk, hey, we can keep talking too. Well, as long as they're serious about talking and not just making a joke of it. But here, some of them say, what will this spermologos say? A spermologos originally was a term for a bird that would peck up grain in the marketplace, but it came to be used not just for these bird brains, literally, but for another kind of bird brain, the dilettantes who would go around the marketplace and just pick up little bits of knowledge here and there. And so they think of Paul that way. Well, yeah, he's got a little bit of this philosophy, a little bit of that philosophy. He was doing his best to relate to them. Paul was not trained as a professional philosopher. He wasn't even trained as a professional orator. He was a Bible major. At least that's what I think, as a professor who teaches doctoral students in Bible, although our degree is called a PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy. So I guess you could view it as a specialized form. But anyway, they saw Paul as not very very knowledgeable. But he was doing the best he could to communicate to them, to contextualize in terminology that they understood. And Paul's audience includes both Stoics and Epicureans. Later in Acts, he's going to have an audience that includes Sadducees and Pharisees, Pharisees being the more popular. Well, he actually had been brought up as a Pharisee. He'd been trained as a Pharisee. And so he says, hey, you guys, I'm a Pharisee, gets the Pharisees on his side. Well, he's going to play a little bit more to the popular Stoics here as well. But actually, Christianity did have more in common with Stoics, especially in the area of ethics, than it had in common with Epicureans. Epicureans believed that there were either no gods or only those known through sensation, that is, the sun, the moon, things like that, might be considered gods. But these gods had no relationship to humanity, no concern for humanity. They were like too high and far off. So they didn't accept the myths, the Greek myths. That may have actually been an advantage at many points. And they were kind of similar to deism in the Western world. The idea that there's a God who created things, but he's not really interested in or keeping up with the natural world today. For Epicureans, well, since there's no gods to answer to, the aim of life is pleasure. But they were often misrepresented. When they said their aim of life was pleasure, they didn't mean the pleasure of sensuality, but the absence of pain in the body and the absence of trouble in the soul. And therefore, death they considered to be, well, definitely pleasure, because you wouldn't have any more pain and you wouldn't have any more trouble. And in the current life, well, the best thing you could do was just avoid pain and avoid things that bothered you too much. This was influential only in the upper classes, and it had declined some by this period, but there were still a number of Epicureans around. Stoics, by contrast, criticized Epicureans heavily, though the differences were not as great between them as they had once been. Seneca, a contemporary of Paul, actually the brother of Gallio, who was the governor before whom Paul appeared in Corinth, soon after he was in Athens, say a year or two afterwards. Seneca, the philosopher, says, Epicurus was a good man, but, really, Lucilius, you need to leave Epicureanism because it's totally corrupted and it's not as good as it once was. Stoics were more popular with the people than Epicureans were. Some actually were more like the Cynics. Cynics were really radical. They stayed radical. They would just have a cloak, staff that they could use actually sometimes for threatening people, give me some money, but wallet for begging and a cup for water and so on. But anyway, most Stoics were kind of more in tune with the culture by this point, but they considered pleasure to be a vice, said, no, instead you need to seek virtue. And of course, Epicureans didn't disagree with virtue being valuable, but they had very different ideas of it. Pleasure was a vice as far as the Stoics were concerned. In terms of cosmology, there were two forces. There was phusis, nature. Paul appeals to nature a couple times in his letters, although there were different kinds of appeals to nature. And logos, or reason. That's what structured the universe. And you have something about that in John chapter 1, although John is taking a more Jewish approach to that, but that's another story. The ethics of equality that Stoics held were very similar to Christianity, although became subverted once Stoics became part of the establishment. I mean, Seneca became the tutor of Nero, who became emperor. So Seneca, was officially employed by the Emperor Claudius. So Stoics kind of gave way to the system some, and Christianity later did the same often. But initially, they both had this radical ethics. They became strict on household codes that had been around from Aristotle and his followers, the Peripatetics. So, Stoics had some things in common with Christians. They had some things that were different, but there was plenty of room for dialogue. Well, now these thinkers, they bring Paul to the Areopagus. They had said two things. What will this idle babbler say? That was probably the Epicureans. And the others, probably the Stoics, they said, oh, he's preaching to us foreign gods, foreign deities. And apparently this was, and John Chrysostom pointed this out many centuries ago, that Paul was preaching to them Jesus and resurrection. Now the Greek word resurrection, anastasis, was also a woman's name. So you've got Jesus and anastasis. Paul is preaching the two of them. And people sometimes preach these binary deities that subsumed other deities, a male and a female deity. Well, here you've got Jesus as a male deity and resurrection is a female deity. And Luke may be laughing a little bit at their expense. John Chrysostom did, and a lot of scholars since him have done the same. Anyway, they brought Paul to the Areopagus. The Areopagus was the high court of Athens. It had maybe about 100 members. Now, the pictures I have here are actually pictures at the Areopagus, but this is the physical Areopagus, from which the council, the Areopagus, got its name. But by this period, the council didn't meet on this physical Areopagus anymore. If you've been there, there's no way you're going to get 100 council members comfortably on this big hill or rock. Maybe they were meeting in this period in the Stoa Basilicus in the Agora, so it wouldn't have been that far to take Paul at this point. And possibly they tested lecturers. They're the high court of Athens. Paul isn't being charged with anything, but local board of education, if somebody was going to be promoted as a speaker or given a chair as a lecturer, they'd have to be tested by this body. But in any case, what Luke's audience is going to think of when they hear of Paul being led to the Areopagus, after he's been said to be preaching foreign gods, they're going to think of Socrates, because pretty much everybody in the urban Eastern Mediterranean world knew the story of Socrates and what had been charged with. Now, the photos I have are not of the Stoa Basilicus, which is no longer standing, but of something that probably looks similar to that. This is the Stoa of Attalus. It's been rebuilt, and so I can give you a picture of that instead. Well, Paul now is going to be speaking to them, and this is going to be my next lesson, but I want to stop the lecture here just so you can digest this much of it first.